everybody. Welcome to another military history Q&A. Oy. So you asked me the Patton question. Alright, okay. Who would win a war if America joined sides with Germany against the Soviet Union? I see some rolling eyes out there. Now knock it off. There's actually some indication why this might not just have been an idea of an angry general. There may have been quite a few reasons why the U.S. might want to have done this. But of course, it is a wildly hypothetical question. But in there, I'm going to try to give you some facts and give you some information that you probably did not know about World War II, about how we got to the Cold War as it was, because a whole lot of things actually happened that was kind of hidden away way up until 92 when it started coming out that there were reasons for the U.S. to actually participate in some attack of the Soviet Union. Lord knows, during World War II and towards the latter end of it, they gave us more than enough reason. And Patton may have been wise to some of these things. Certainly there was a reason why one of our most famous generals suggested at the end of World War II that we were fighting the wrong enemy, and America should join sides with the Germans and take on the Russians. That is probably also what got him booted from his position before he died. Now, that being said, it's a valid question, and it's come up every now and again. And I thought, well, let's try to break that down. Now, let's try to break down how we got to the Cold War in the first place. Because it all started back during the Russian Revolution. And mind you, I have to insert a few speculations in order to make the point of the bigger speculation as of who would have won. Thank you, David. I really needed that question before my coffee. Who would have won that war? Because, of course, we got to start with, well, when exactly would this magic conflict altercation have taken place? In 1945, just around the time the Germans would have been defeated anyway? Would it have taken place in 1941, before Barbarossa? That would certainly make a difference. Would it have taken place in the middle of the war? So you never specified exactly when, but I have an idea, I have a solution. Real quick, if we joined up with the Germans before Barbarossa, which should also, mind you, been before Pearl Harbor, and attacked the Soviet Union, I think the Soviet Union would have been defeated, because obviously no one's going to switch sides and join a war from one day to the next. It takes a little bit of thought and planning before you get into these things. But if the United States had made contact with the Germans in 1940-41 and decided to side with the Axis and attack the Soviet Union, with the logistical capability of the United States and no Lend-Lease, mind you, Lend-Lease to the Russians were 5-10% of Russian production. However, there's a lot of raw materials, a lot of arms, a lot, 420,000 trucks that the Russians needed throughout the time of the war that they would then not have gotten, that the Germans would have gotten. Before Barbarossa, if America had sided, well, I guess Churchill would have had to drink himself to death. But as much as he hated and distrusted Stalin, he hated Hitler more. And he had certainly made alliances with anti-Nazi fractions while he was broke before World War II actively broke out, that sort of committed himself to an anti-Nazi stance. So if the Americans had come in 1941 as they decide, well, we're going to attack Russia, it would have put Britain in a very interesting, precarious position that I don't really know how. Well, Churchill would probably have to resign. If this would have been before or after the invasion of France, well, maybe the French would have seen the inevitability of having to secede some of what they had taken during the Treaty of Versailles. And there was a lot of volunteers throughout Europe that joined with Germany because they saw Bolshevism, communism, Marxism as the actual threat towards Europe. So if America had sided, maybe, depending on when, brought France and Britain into this fray and rolled towards Russia, I think Russia would have been defeated. The Germans almost did it. And of course that would also have lent to some sort of negotiated settlement with the Japanese, freeing up a whole lot more troops there, which would also have seen the Japanese probably side with Germany and then America against Russia, which would have made a two-pronged attack, that one that never happened because the Japanese did not back up Germany when they were outside the gates of Moscow. So 1940, 1941, it would have been a very different war, and I suppose it would have been the actual war against communism, because it would have been a war of liberation of the Soviet people. Otherwise, the Americans would never have gone for that. We're still being hypothetical here, so go with me. But before Barbarossa, in that year or two, if the Americans had teamed up with the Germans, I think Russia would have been defeated, because it would have been a world alliance. So that being said, that is the least of the interesting of the speculations. The real interesting one is, well, when then? Then we're looking at the end of the war when Patton said it. Why is that possible? Well, we have to go back to the Russian Revolution and World War I, which ended because of the Russian Revolution, and Russia made a settlement peace with Germany. They gave up 1,000 square miles of territory and withdrew. But how did they do that? The British sided with the anti-Bolshevist whites even after World War II. Even after World War I was over. There were British battleships in the Baltics taking on the Red Fleet, and there were Germans fighting on the ground in 1919 as well. So the communists, which were a minority in numbers in Russia, who took over leadership of Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky, well, there must have been some interest, there were some interest on behalf of the warring nations for the Russian Revolution to at least get somewhat underway. I don't know how well thought out that was, but Trotsky was living in New York, and he was smuggled out of New York and into Russia, to the great objections of the Canadians, who knew, but he was well funded and he was taken care of and protected by State Department. So he, with some government knowledge, was smuggled to Russia to start the Russian Revolution. And Lenin, on the same token, was smuggled out of Switzerland by the Germans and into Russia to start the Russian Revolution. So I could see the Germans' point of view, World War I, why they would want to stir up the pot behind the lines, get the Tsar kicked out of office, get a revolution going, because a Russia fighting itself would have no time to fight Germany, and they would have to leave the war, which they did. And I'm not entirely sure what the entities in America's interest was in that, because they were fighting on the other side, and the moment the Russians would withdraw from the war, a whole bunch of German soldiers would come to the West and fight the British and American allies. So that was not exactly an ideal situation for the Americans or those who had an interest in stirring up the Russian Revolution. The British opposed it venomously, and in battle and with ships and actively fighting, which of course led to great contention. And Stalin never trusted the British, and the British never trusted or liked Stalin. Of course, Stalin also rolled over Trotsky and Lenin, both of whom could have said to have some Western sympathies, since they got them both into Russia and in some way with some bags of money to fund the Russian Revolution. Stalin got them out of the way, and he took power, and he was beholden to no one. Churchill did not trust or like Stalin, and America never recognized the Soviet Union as a member of the League of Nations. America refused to deal with Soviet Union because now it was a Marxist communist dictatorship, which was obvious already then. And interestingly enough, brings me back to the point, it was not until 1933 that the Soviet Union was recognized by America. Why? Because the great FDR recognized them and saw an economic opportunity in dealing with this dictator. So Roosevelt did it. And apparently Roosevelt had, throughout World War II, an affinity for helping the Russians, Lend-Lease, and so on and so forth. A lot of help went from America to the Russians, a lot of aid for billions of dollars that was never really repaid. I don't think it was until 1972 that some fraction of that was paid back. Very small, only 10% was paid back and the rest was forgiven. So Lend-Lease to Russia cost America quite a lot. But that was FDR's dealings. And he died in 1945. And if we go out of... It was very obvious, FDR stated on numerous occasions that he wanted to go to war with Germany. There's no question. It's in his speeches. He said it publicly. And if FDR really hated Germany that much that he wanted to go to war with them at all cost, even though the American population at large definitely did not want to get involved in another European war, that leads us back to dealings with the British that finagled America into that war one way or another. I firmly believe that the United States could have, not saying they should have, but they could have stayed out of the European World War II. They could also have avoided a war with Japan. And all that, and the business dealings, and what happened there, happened under FDR. Which could then be sort of be said that he was a rather Russian-friendly president. So when he died, that would have opened up the opportunity for a switch of foreign policy against the Soviet Union. Remember, we're still hypothetical here. If you want to make this work, I have to make this work. I could tie some ends together here. So if we're looking at 1945 and America switching sides, joining the Germans and turning on the Russians, that's a big turnaround. I'm going to go over what everybody had available at that time to see if we can sort of plot out logistically if this was a possible victory at all. Based on the numbers, the soldiers, the tanks, the production, the oil, could this have been done and who would have won this? We should also remember in 1945 you're looking at a Japanese war. America is rather heavily engaged in that. Australians, New Zealanders, British forces all fighting in the Pacific. For, at this point in time, a new American president to have sat down with Churchill and told him we were switching sides, well, no, Churchill was a bit of a drunk, and if nothing would lead him to drink more than this, then that certainly would have. You also had Hungary, Romania, which had, at this point in time, switched sides against Germany. Would they switch back? And of course, the Italians. Who would want them on their side? many things can be said for the Italians, but they always seem to come down on the winning side, and they switched sides twice in that war. So switch sides a third time and go back against the Russians. I guess that's not a stretch. But I think we should leave them out of the equation, other than use Italian air bases to bomb Russian oil production or oil facilities under the Russian control in this now new front towards the east, a joint front. And of course, some peace settlement would have to be done with the Japanese to sort of finish this, end this, and keep them out of the way. In 1945, however, there was a lot of German uranium. There was the infrared proximity sensors that the United States used to detonate their nuclear bombs over Japan. They were developed by a German named Heinz Schlickert, who could now safely side with the Americans, which means that all of the German nuclear scientists and their yellow cake uranium and enriched uranium would go straight to whichever program, nuclear bomb program, was the closest to being ready at that time in 1945, which means the war, a joint war, let's call it something, against the Soviet Union would become a nuclear war real fast, in which the Soviet Union was nowhere near ready to compete or retaliate. They couldn't have done any of this. They didn't get their nuclear weapon until 1949. Of course, there's also the poisonous gases and the chemicals on both sides that were stored and could have been used against the other. That's a whole different mess. Germany would be within reach of American heavy bombers that would fly from German soil. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Let's go back to the reasons a little bit. Why would it be that America, after all this fighting and rhetoric against the Nazi regime, well, obviously, if the Americans were going to side with the Germans against Russia, it would be with a Germany, not a National Socialist Germany. So the Nazis and Hitler would have to go. I'm not sure I can make this hypothetical work without the Nazis being out of the equation, which is not really that hard, since 2% of the German population joined the Nazi Party, and say, well, not all of those did it because they were ardent Nazis. They did it for economic reasons. So those in the soldier leadership and the top-ranking SS that were Nazi members, it really wasn't that big of numbers to set aside and put in a camp somewhere and keep them out of this equation. So we're back to the Germans, and a majority of German soldiers, I do believe the majority of German soldiers fought against the Russians because they saw it as in their national interest to defeat the Russians, because they saw them as a threat towards all of Europe and European culture, which is probably not entirely wrong. And I say probable because I misspoke. It was not entirely wrong, because Marxist-Leninism seeks to spread across borders, take away national culture, religion, freedoms, and makes everything and everybody beholden to the state. That is, if you want to break down the difference between Nazis and communists, it is, at least in National Socialism, you can have free enterprise and business. Don't go against the state, but you can still be independently businessman. You can be wealthy. You can still pursue a line of work and business and in capitalism in that sense. In Russian communism, Marxism, you can't. Everything belongs to the state. And even at the top of the state, you have corruption. So, and as it's been seen since the war, after World War II, the Soviet Union gobbled up and kept every country they had soldiers on, and pretty much did all of that. Shot and killed or deported anybody who opposed them, shut down private businesses and enterprises, made everything part of the state, and had a vast security apparatus to control the populations, and it became police state dictatorship in every country they were. Closed the churches and so on and so forth. Exactly what had been the fear in Germany, and what Patton cited as one of the reasons was that the Russians were openly defying any of the Treaty of Yalta promises and breaking promise left, right, and center. They were not leaving from Eastern Europe. Patton knew this. The Germans knew this. Did FDR know this? Did he continue to appease them? I know that Churchill was fearing what was going to happen. Maybe FDR had this delusion that he could control Stalin. And remember, Stalin after World War I was not really a massive superpower of production. It was a country trying to rebuild from war with destroyed agriculture, and needed massive modernization, which Stalin did at the cost of some 30 million of his own people and the starvation of a third of the Ukrainians. Certainly Stalin didn't do his own people any favor, which means there's be a lot of those in the Soviet territories that would be very happy to be liberated. In fact, in 1941, they saw the Germans as liberators, until it became rather clear that they didn't really get much more say under that management either. So, for the Americans to come and say, we are going to liberate the Russian people from the communist dictatorship, I could see that sell. You could probably turn around quite a bit of the Germans. You could possibly entice quite a few of the Hungarians, Yugoslavs as well. The Poles, you know what? World War II, it just sucked to be Polish. And Polish certainly hated the Germans for invading them. Did they hate them more than the Russians for also invading them? At roughly the same time on the other side? Well, the Russians killed 22,000 Polish officers. And the British and Polish were still so paranoid that they, even after Barbarossa, has misgivings that Stalin and Hitler was collaborating, which is rather ridiculous. But certainly we're back to the reasons why Patton would have suggested that we join with the Germans and the Axis powers and attack Russia. Well, the Russia had given us quite a lot of reasons. They had broken the promises of Yalta. They were obviously expanding their communist ideology. They were definitely killing off and executing anybody who stood in their way in the local countries. And they were killing American POWs and airmen and sending them to gulags in Siberia. Oh, you didn't know this? Well, let me enlighten you. It's a bit of history for you. In 1992, Boris Yeltsin testified to Congress that Stalin had, during and after the war, executed American prisoners of war liberated from German camps by the Russians, brought to Russian camps and there executed, or were forced to renounce their U.S. citizenship and were still living at that time, 1992, in some of these Russian locations. That was Boris Yeltsin who said this. The largest group of Americans imprisoned by the Soviet Union was including over 730 pilots and other airmen who either made forced landings on Soviet territory or were shut down. For instance, here is a summary also of a statement to Congress at that time. 73 U.S. citizens perished between 1941 and 43 in Camp Kulbyshev. I'm not going to even try to pronounce that. Several sources assess that Americans liberated from both German and Japanese prison camps at the end of World War II was taken to the former Soviet Union. More specific, American servicemen liberated from German camps ended up in Soviet camps, one called Rybak and Streicha, where they eventually died. Also in November-December 1945, 6 groups of American servicemen liberated by the Soviet army in Manchuria were taken to northern Siberia, where they were subsequently executed. And more reports refer to groups of over 14 Americans liberated by Soviets in the Habin camp who ended up in the Russian camp Kulma. I've heard these stories before. As a matter of fact, I wrote a novel where that is one of the larger featured stories. Russians killed American soldiers and air crews during World War II. Some of the Americans had even been sent there to fight against the Germans, were shot down, found behind lines, or were just not trusted. Ended up in Siberia, and some of these camps have been identified where they eventually died. One of the main reasons why the British and Americans force compelled to hand over people such as General Vaslov and Cossacks was specifically under threats of Stalin that the American servicemen in his control or was held in his sphere of interest would be shot if he didn't. Now, during a war, if you take some of mine and you shoot some of my soldiers, that makes you my enemy. So I get where Patton was coming from, because certainly he was privy to this information, and certainly he also read German intelligence reports of what the Russians were doing and planning to do, as well as what he had then seen and heard, even during the Battle of Warsaw, with the Warsaw Uprising. On more than one occasion, British transport planes trying to fly in supplies to the resistance in Warsaw was shot down by Russian planes. And there's been several standoffs and shootouts between Americans and Russians over the protection of German civilians, as it happens in the case that I'm aware of. So there was underlying hostilities between Americans, British, and Russians. And if the Russians were actively killing American soldiers, men and pilots, that's a pretty good reason to go to war against them. But you have to convince the whole world that the great cause, the Nazis, the great evil, the threat to democracy, well, that may not have been the biggest problem communism was. I guess it turned out to be, because communism persisted and is still trying to spread to this very day. So I could see why there could have been an interest at some point in time to side with the Germans against the Russians. As indeed they did. After, there wasn't more than a few years after the World War II ended that the American punishment of Nazis, war criminals, and Germany in general stopped, and Germany officially became part of the eventually the NATO alliance against the Soviet Union. So this could have happened a few years before, and it probably, as Patton said, would have been easier to do in 1945 while the war was still going, and Russia was fairly stretched, and they did have manpower shortages. Opposite that, the American army was at its highest in manpower, and the factories were pumping out munitions, weapons, tanks, planes, an unheard of rate. And of course they were able to do this enormous build-up before the invasion of Normandy. So certainly they could have done it again. They had all of France as an operating base, and all of Western Germany that they could use as a springboard for an invasion against Russia. There were millions of German POWs, soldiers that definitely did not want to get caught by the Russians. there were over 2 million Russians, many of whom were in German uniform, that definitely didn't want to be handed over to the Russians. It's said that 1 in 10 Germans taken prisoner after the invasion of Normandy were actual Russian. You have Václav's army, several hundred thousands in number, and you have all the Cossacks, and you have a lot of people that really would not be well off being sent back to Russia. Those numbers builds up. Let's take a look at the numbers. What the hell? For comparison, I'm going to try to, when I can, give you the 1941 number just so we could see how things would go if we had done this thing before Barbarossa. U.S. Army, 1941, had 1.5 million soldiers in the Army, almost 300,000 in the Navy, 50,000 in the Marines. In 1945, the U.S. Army comprised of 8,267,000 soldiers, 3,380,000 Navy, 474,000 Marines. That is 12,200,009 and change under arms in 1945. That's a significant force. What did Russia have at the same time? In 1941, January, Russia had about 3,858,000 soldiers under arms. In 1945, in April, 10,238,000 soldiers under arms and 1.2 million recuperating in hospitals. That is also a significant number. Of course, we can't discount the British entirely, no matter how Mr. Churchill feels about allying up with the Germans at this point, not to mention how Eisenhower would feel about it. After Dunkirk 1940, the British had about 1.6 million men and change. But now, 1945, the British have 2,900,020 million soldiers under arms. That would leave, if you take a willing participant in this speculation, British and American armies would comprise of about 15,200,000 soldiers, whereas the Russians, if we pull all of their wounded out of the hospitals, have about 11,400,000. That gives an advantage to the British and Americans. However, we are in Europe, and the Russian army is strong. And to that, we still have to add the Germans that we are talking about fighting with, plus the Russians and other personnel in uniform that would add weight to this equation. We said there's about 2 million Russians in Germany as well that would willingly fight the Russians. Alright, so that brings the Allied strength up to 17 million. And then about the German force. What did the Germans have? There's quite a few different speculations and numbers out there as to how many surrendered, how many prisoners of war were there. There was about 2.5 million German soldiers as prisoners of war. But there were more than 2.5 million soldiers that in 1945 that fought and surrendered. And we're closer looking to 7.9, almost 8 million German soldiers. Some records even say up to 11 possible German combatants of all ages, including wounded and Volkssturm and so on, that could carry arms at that time. But we definitely have 2.5 million we can add on to this. So now we're looking at about 20 million soldiers. And then we have the loose change. Say if there was 7 million, putting the figure rather low, of German soldiers, we're looking at 25 million British, German, and American soldiers that could be available for a fight against 11,400,000 Russians. That means there's twice as many Allied soldiers fighting against the Russians. Remember Barbarossa? Russians outnumbered the Germans in tanks and planes, numbers. And yet they were fairly soundly defeated, but Russia's big, so we have to go far. And Russia have a lot of tanks and arms to defend all this. And we always know that the defender usually needs depending on what general genius you talk to, between about a 3-to-1 advantage favoring the attacker. So the Russians theoretically could dig in and defend successfully with half as many soldiers as that would now be attacking them. But what if we take the Lend-Lease away, and how much equipment was on the ground? Because equipment will run, well, tanks will run over soldiers. And without trucks, American trucks, maybe the Russians wouldn't have gotten that far. Well, so think about it. This could not have been a spontaneous, hypothetical, debate. If Americans were going to turn on the Russians, they would probably not wait until the Germans had been beaten and millions of German soldiers had gone into Russian captivity and their equipment had been destroyed. Probably done it a few months before, when there were still Germans fighting and there was still German equipment that was viable, but it needed fuel and needed transportation. They might also have seen this coming sometime before and stopped their Lend-Lease to the Russians. No more trucks, no more rubber. Say no more canned foods. American canned foods consist of about 80% of the Lend-Lease, about 80% of Russian soldiers' canned food diet. However, the Russians only ate about 10% of canned food. So, just watching the numbers, let's look at the numbers of tanks and production leading up to the end of the war. Since armored numbers matter, let's see who made what and where it could possibly be. The Russians had made about 76,275 pieces of armor during the war. I'm talking about heavy armor like self-propelled guns and the T-34s. In fact, there's 35,400 T-34s made, 23,200 T-34-85s with a longer gun. Of the Su-76, there was 12,000 made, 2,600 of the Su-85, and about 1,500 of the Su-100. Whereas in 1945, since, for years the Germans and Russians have been busy dismantling each other's armor at willy-nilly on the Eastern Front, we have to look at what was definitely available and made in 1945. 1945, 12,000 T-34-85s were made, 2,900 Su-76s were made, and 1,000 Su-100s were made. So we can at least agree that there are 16,000 pieces of armor available. Definitely more, but let's go with that for at least one. So the Russians were building decently, but everything in this war is about tanks, planes. I'm not going to start counting how many small arms and mortars were made, because I'm pretty sure there was enough for everybody to get one in Europe at that time. However, Americans produced about 88,616 armored fighting vehicles during the war, versus the Russians, 76,000. Add to that, the Russians and the Americans equally had some 30+ thousand of various armored fighting vehicles, personnel carriers, various other things. I'm only counting tanks and self-propelled guns. The U.S. produced 303,000 planes during the war, some of which actually ended up in Russia, making this number a little hard to see, but we'll break down the Lend-Lease in a minute. The UK made 120,000 planes during the war. Russia made 158,000 planes during the war. And Germany made 120,000 planes during the war, many of which were sitting around airfields without any fuel, especially some of the new fighters that could take on the Russian Air Force if they were proper fueled and maintained. I'm thinking Me-262. If we take the 1945 number alone, the Russians produced about 20,000 planes in 1945, while America produced 46,000 planes in 1945. Of course, the Americans fought the Pacific War still, but doubled the plane capacity. And a lot of the Russian factories were run initially with some American advisors and American equipment. And if we go back to a considered and planned attack by the U.S., a lot of this aid would not have gotten there. Let's see how much aid that was, shall we? Now, the Lend-Lease aid from America to Russia started in 1941 and ended in 1945. However, in 1945, 80 million Russians were dependent on food rations. And the U.S. delivered about $11 billion in foods and materials, 400,000 jeeps, 12,000 armored fighting vehicles, 7,000 tanks. 1,300 of those were M3 Lees, and 4,000 Shermans. 11,000 aircraft. 4,700 of these were the Bell P-39 Air Cobras. And they delivered 1.75 million tons of food. And this is the key. Besides all the rubber manufacture and raw materials, 427,000 trucks and 1,900 locomotives. That made the Russian army mobile. We take all that out of the equation. I'm not sure the Russian army could have transported all its foods, logistics, and soldiers up to the German border with the speed with which they did. Of course, given the Russians a lot of this, freed them up to produce predominantly tanks that did make it up to the German border. Just for comparison, I want to throw in the numbers for the buildup of Normandy, which was about 200,000 vehicles, 600,000 tons of supplies, 6,500 ships and crafts of different sizes, 11,000 aircraft, and 1.5 million soldiers that was bottled up in the UK by 1944. That was the build-up just to Normandy, while America was supplying pretty much every other Allied fighting nation to some degree, and fighting Japan at its high point. And the Russians' manpower was, the Russians were down to, at this point, recruiting teenagers, just like the Germans were doing. So now, to this we have to add up all the German equipment that the Allies could have counted on, besides the expertise and know-how on how to fight the Russians and a slow build-up of Galen's intelligence network in the East, which I guess to some degree the Americans ended up benefiting from anyway. Well, and when I say benefit, I'm using that term somewhat loosely, but I think you've seen my other Q&A episode about Galen, so we'll leave him alone for now. In 1945 alone, the Germans manufactured 4,500 tanks and SP guns. And that's only over a couple of months, basically, of what the war, what was there. Throughout the entire war of all types of tanks and armor, the Germans manufactured about 50,000. And in 1944, despite Allied bombing and leveling of German cities, German manufacturing of just about everything continued to go up. At the high point in 1944, with 13,954 armored vehicles produced. So certainly, going by the numbers again, the Allies would have more men, more tanks, far more planes to attack Russia than Russia would have to defend itself. So the last piece of this equation that's missing is the raw materials, one of which is actually rather interesting on a number of levels. Now, the United States produced far more coal, iron ore, and crude oil than any other nations. That's hardly a surprise. The British produced more coal, iron ore, and oil almost than the Russians. The British produced 3 times as much coal than the Soviet Union. They produced twice as much iron ore as the Soviet Union. And they almost produced the same amount of crude oil as Soviet Union. With the Soviet Union outproducing Britain by 2%. 20%, sorry. However, the United States outproduced Russia by 8 times as much oil as Russia. The interesting thing, I thought, was Germany outproduced Russia in iron ore by 5 times during the war, which is rather interesting. They also produce more coal than the United States during the war. Of course, when it came to crude oil production, that's where Germany had a problem. They were producing less than half of what England was, a third of what the Soviet Union was, and couldn't come even near close to competing with crude oil production of the United States. That is what slowed down the German war machine. So lack of oil and fuel for everything. Which means there's a whole lot of things sitting around with no fuel that once refueled and rearmed could lend a significant comeback, especially bolstered by the US logistics, of which there was plenty. And there's one tank we have to talk about because it's going to come up and it bothers me. So, we all remember at the parade in 1945 through Berlin, where the Russians proudly displayed their new Joseph Stalin III super heavy tank that scared and mystified all the American generals, supposedly that, oh my God, look at what they have. Well, now history books generally will say that the JS3 tank was not really involved in the war and did not come off the production line sufficient numbers until after the war had ended, with about 2,500 of them made and being in service for a few years. Some of them took place, were sent to Egypt and fought in the Israeli-Egyptian war, where they were a rather formidable and well-armored tank. The American super heavy Pershing tank, about 2,200 made. I think about 40 of them made it onto into France at the end of World War II. And we could say, well, if the Russians had all of these Joseph III super heavy tanks, that was superior to any other German or Allied tank. But they weren't there. Now, we always thought they were not there, but I actually found in the Russian archives a photo of a group of JS3s rolling through a burning Polish or East German village. So some were there and some were involved in the fighting. However, maybe for the hypothetical of it, let's say they had a few thousand of those and we had a few thousand of our Pershings. If the Russians would show up on a battlefield with super heavy tanks, well, so would we. Tankers' doctrine has pretty much always been tanks are not really designed to fight other tanks, although they certainly seem to do so. So could we find anti-tank weaponry to defeat the Pershing III Scourge and Joseph IIs and some of the Russian super heavy tanks? Well, you know what? We didn't really need to, because we have 11 to 20,000 combat aircraft flying cover overhead. That would pretty much destroy all of them. The super heavy German tanks, the Tiger IIs, didn't stand a chance against the American planes that flew overhead and fired rockets and what have you at them. The same thing would unfold towards the east. So that brings us back to what is the conclusion? Who would have won this magical battle? Are we looking for a quick blitzkrieg victory or prolonged battle? I'm going to put my money on a U.S. allied German entity attacking the Soviet Union in 1945, having planned to do so from 1944, because American planes could reach the Russian manufacturing centers behind the Urals. Even if a peace hadn't been obtained with Japan, maybe they would have turned sides as well. I'm going to leave the Japanese completely out of this equation, because I don't think we need to even bring them in, even if there was a Pacific campaign still ongoing and a war against Russia would have taken several years. We would have swept in with enormous amounts of logistics, rebuilt manufacturing in Germany, and brought a lot of resources to the German army. A German, U.S., English army would outnumber the Russians by at least double, at least. And there comes all the other armies. Plus, you would have 300 or 300,000 sitting in the Kurland Peninsula. That would be proper supplied real quick, and would hit the Russians from a flank. There's the Hungary, Czechoslovakia. Even if they would have been overrun, even if they hadn't joined the new alliance, they would have been overrun, and they could be used as a springboard. It would not be 200,000 in Norway. Maybe Norway would have joined as well. Maybe other countries would have joined in the final stand against communist Russia as a true sense of liberation, because there wouldn't have been none of the war on civilians and atrocities as we would have seen on the Eastern Front prior. I am guessing, this is a hypothetical, bite me. I think we could have hit the Russians from both flanks and from the front, pushed them back, way back, almost, well, certainly to 1941 borders, possibly to late 1941 lines. At some point in time, even again, logistics would have been an issue. Finland would have changed sides. They would have had to, because you would probably have a Norwegian, Swedish, Finnish entity that would join with a British-American entity and a German entity. And now you had another flank where you could land troops up in Finland and in Norway that could hit the Russians from that angle. But there would be no partial acceptance of, or there could have been, or there couldn't have been, a partial acceptance of a Russian state on the other side of the Urals. This would have to be a battle to the end, until all of Russia had surrendered. And it would have been a war against Stalin and his communists, to the point where possibly parts of the Russian population or even military would have risen up against Stalin. Because let's face it, every dictatorship is a little fickle. You never really know when you're going to be replaced by the next guy. And there might be parts of the Russian military that would have seen such an attack have been caused by Stalin's over-ambitious foreign policy. Could have been. Paranoid people do strange things. But then again, we are talking about how to join with the Germans in attacking Russia. So, speaking of strange things. But I think there would have been a lull in fighting in 1945, not far from Moscow, just like in 1941, because of stretched logistics and additional buildup needed. but certainly Russia would have been pushed straight back to the Baltics, possibly partially out of the Ukraine. All the territory the Russians had taken in 44, 45 would be lost, which would include a massive amount of arms and material, and possibly the best frontline soldiers. And this would bring Moscow and the factories of the Urals within bombing range of forward operating Air Force bases now stationed in Poland and in Western Russia that would have been taken in the 45 summer and autumn. And a lot of lessons learned, backed up by American logistics and production capabilities, that I think that would have won the battle. The Russians would be outproduced. There would be no more Lend-Lease. Ukraine and the oil fields would fall. Plus, we could also harry them from the Black Sea from that side. Of course, there's also a battlefield in Iran where Russians were present and could have kicked out the Allies there, obtained some oil from that venue to keep their war effort going. But if we could bomb all the productions and the factories, hypothetically, I don't see it being a winnable situation. Of course, you have to explain to everybody, including your constituents back in America, so important when you make unpopular decisions, you had to get people on your side, that we spent 3 years fighting the Nazis, and now we're going to side with them to take on the Russians. I do not want to be the public statements for the White House who's going to put that one out and explain it, for one. But, of course, brings us back to 1941. If we did it before war had been declared between America and Germany, and let's face it, even from the naval treaty in the 20s after World War I, there was some skepticism between the British and the Americans, not exactly trusting each other. And certainly, if you look at Joseph Kennedy's reports back to FDR on how he viewed Churchill, that was not very favorable. And he was even afraid that Churchill was going to have him assassinated, and he wrote as much. So there was a healthy bit of distrust between the British and Americans coming out of the 1910s and 20s, despite having just been allied in World War I. So for Germany to have reached out to the U.S. as a trades partner in the 30s, which has still been hard because they didn't really have much money, but the U.S. were lending them money. You ask who would win such a war. Weapons manufacturers and the bankers somewhere would win this war, no matter who won on the battlefield. A better relationship between Germany and America could have existed and been fueled. And remember, while you like it or not, there was quite a bit of Nazi sympathies in America. In the 1930s, we had an American Nazi party. This was, of course, and like I always said, and people always forget, you have to look at history through the eyes of the time, through what you knew at that time. So it's easy to have sat in the United States in 1930 and thought, well, Hitler's building the roads, he's putting people to work, he sounds like he's a strong man with a plan. What happened of atrocities under the Nazi dictatorship, well, that did not really come out in the 30s. Certainly not to we didn't know anything near what we know now. And that being said, if we dial that back, there might have been public support for a German-American alliance. Like I said, Churchill would have objected that, and FDR objected that as well. but I'm not sure either one of them objected to a German alliance based on just common sense and a sense of appeasement alone. I think there was more things were at stake and more things were in play than just that. And we have to remember, it was France and England that declared war on Germany, although because of the invasion of Poland, although they certainly didn't do anything about it. They sat there for another 6 months, having declared war, giving Germany the excuse to invade France. Whereas, I get it, how much are you going to appease a madman, or a crazy guy, or a dictator? How much are you going to appease someone like that, believing that they're probably going to break their promises anyway, which is the reason why they declared war on Germany instead of letting Hitler have his Poland, not declare war, and sit there tacitly on the sidelines and let Germany fight it out with Russia on their own, let them destroy each other, because they didn't like either one of them. However, that being said, why did the Allies allow Stalin to kill their allies, to kill their own servicemen and, not women, men and pilots, to break every promise he's made, why they didn't trust each other whatsoever? And Stalin had signed a pact with Hitler and invaded Poland as well. So why did they allow Stalin, in a much bigger country, with a much more dangerous, internationally dangerous ideology, to break all of his promises? Well, you explain foreign policy to me and I'll buy you a piece of cheese. Anyway, the quick, dirty answer is, I think if the West had sided against Russia, we would have beaten Russia eventually, and it would have taken a little time. It would have taken a few years, but eventually we could have bombed Russia into capitulation. Not to mention the part about the nuclear weapons that would come offline in 1945 and could be deployed against Moscow. And if we were to nuke Moscow and kill Stalin, well, then we're back to would the war have ended with Stalin dead? That's the same question if in 1941, after Barbarossa, if they had managed to encircle Moscow and kill Stalin. He already transferred his government to another city that I'm not even going to pronounce, 700 kilometers southeast of Moscow. So there was a contingency for Stalin to continue his government, even if Moscow had fallen. But if Moscow had fallen and he had been killed alongside with some of the top leaders, because you wouldn't have to encircle Moscow, you'd have to make sure everybody was there and drop the bomb and kill them all. And then what? Then you're dealing with military leaders who may be more pragmatic than Stalin, maybe more logistical sound than Stalin, and may be boiled into a whole lot of infighting against each other. Anyway, that would be my, I'm quoting Joseph P. Farrell, high-octane speculation of what would have happened if we had done that, and when we had done it. And since this is probably an unbearable long episode by now, I'm going to shut up, eat my donut, and go to a secret undisclosed location and work out. Please send me your questions. LostBattlefields.com, where all the photos and episodes are up as well. Follow me on my YouTube so I can get back on TV. Send me your questions, military history Q&A at mail.com. And that was something else I wanted to tell you. Oh yeah, are you enjoying my episodes of The Amazing Ostwald? Are you looking forward to Amazing Forts? And that's also going to be one of the last Nazi secret. Hopefully I can squeeze that out to you in December. If you're not all locked up in your houses, so much the better. And if you are, I'll do my best to entertain you. Send me your questions and have an awesome weekend. Bye.